Thousands of protesters marched in Washington on Saturday as rallies around the United States to protest racial inequality and police brutality entered a 12th day. Protests were sparked by the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis after a white officer knelt on his neck for nearly 9 minutes with fellow officers beside him. Since then, supporters in the U.S. and around the globe have taken to the streets in huge numbers to demand equal justice under the law. Some activists called on social media for 1 million people to attend Saturday's rally in the U.S. Capitol. Local media predicted tens of thousands would attend, and already by noon, thousands gathered at the Lincoln Memorial, the White House, and the Capitol building. Police in the United States have been criticized for their aggressive response to the mostly peaceful protests, which at times have given way to violence and looting. On Saturday, cops in D.C. were out in smaller numbers around the marchers and generally in a more relaxed posture, but a Reuters photographer saw several hundred uniformed military personnel, most wearing body armor and carrying shields, at the newly fortified White House grounds early on Saturday.
A statue of a 17th century slave trader was pulled down in the UK city Bristol on Sunday, as protests against police brutality and racism continued for a second day. The statue of Edward Colston was dragged through the streets and thrown in a river, as a part of demonstrations that have spread across the world, sparked by the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis. In London, tens of thousands of protesters like Fiona Collins gathered at the US Embassy.
I'm sick of having to explain to my children that because they're black, they have to act a certain way, they have to behave a certain way, they have to work 10 times harder to get anywhere in life. And I've had enough of it. I don't want it for their children.
On Saturday, thousands of protesters gathered in central London for a peaceful demonstration. And adding a touch of star power to the crowds, the Queen of Pop herself, Madonna. Saturday ended with a small number clashing with mounted police near Prime Minister Boris Johnson's Downing Street residence. And London Police Chief Cressida Dick said 27 officers had been injured in, quote, shocking and completely unacceptable assaults, including 14 on Saturday. Anger over police treatment of ethnic minorities has sparked protests across the world, and on Sunday crowds could be seen taking a knee of defiance in cities including Brussels, Rome and Madrid.
Mass peaceful protests in London to condemn police violence Sunday later gave way to violence. The crowd of tens of thousands dwindled into a small group of people who faced off with police. Crowds shouted chants in support of the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and for better treatment in the UK.
We want to be treated the same way that you lot are treated. We want to be treated with the same respect.
Police arrested more than 40 people over the weekend for offences including violent disorder and assault on emergency service workers. At least 27 officers were injured, including 2 seriously. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson said on Twitter, people have a right to protest peacefully while observing social distancing, but they have no right to attack the police and that the demonstrations have been subverted by thuggery.
No justice!
Earlier in the day, protesters vandalised a memorial to former British leader Winston Churchill, calling him racist. And in Bristol, the statue of slave trader Edward Colston was pulled down and thrown into a river. There were similar scenes in Belgium, where police used tear gas and water cannon to disperse protesters who'd gathered near a colonial statue. It marked a second weekend of demonstrations in Europe, mirroring protests in the US sparked by the death of George Floyd in police custody.